Hello, everyone. Welcome to ITS 362. So let me share the slides. So you should be seeing the slides right now. I'll wait for a few minutes for everyone to come in, and then I'll do the course participation. This is the last week for that. But I have to take a roll call. Okay, so now let's go ahead and get started with the topic for today. All right, so this is the last, this week and maybe the next week is the last 2 weeks of review type of material. So remember, so far we've just been covering JavaScript, really, a bit of more of a review than anything else. And in about 2 weeks, then we will start with jQuery, which is basically the main topic of our. So people are still coming in. We'll be covering jQuery, which is really the main topic, or the first new topic, I guess, of the course. So as you know, jQuery, is very much object-oriented. And so that's one of the main topics. That's the topic we'll cover this week, or start covering at least. And we're just going to look at how we're just going to look at how JavaScript works as an object-oriented, with an object-oriented approach. So let's call this object-oriented JavaScript, as you can see in the title there. All right, there will be a homework assignment. Obviously, this assignment now gets a little bit more, involved, right? So, but it'll be the same. It'll be the same grade calculator. You're just going to now take the approach of object-oriented. And I did post some starter code already, so you can take a look at that on Brightspace for this homework assignment. It's very simple, but it's got some initial ideas there. Okay, so today, as you've seen now, the approach that I'll do every week, I'll do a short lecture, a few slides, and then after that, we're just going to get into a few problems, a few examples. We'll take a look at those on how to do object-oriented items. So we'll create some ideas there, and that should be the beginning. All right, so let's go ahead, I guess, and start the slideshow here. Oh, let me do the course participation. Once I get started, I always have a tendency to forget. So let me just take a picture. All right, so I think I got everyone, hopefully. All right. Okay, so we are now ready to start with our slides. So, okay, I'm sharing them, starting the slideshow. And you should now, okay, there we go. So, as I said, we're still talking about client-side scripting. We're still talking about JavaScript, but we're now making, the jump to object-oriented JavaScript. Obviously, you guys have taken programming courses, so you know what object-oriented programming is, and you've taken JavaScript. So really, maybe the new thing here is that we're combining both ideas. All right, so you can see that there is the topic. So, we'll cover, just revisit the concept of OOP, or object-oriented programming, which you should know. And then we'll just do examples of OOP in JavaScript itself. And then as time permits, we'll cover some of these ideas through DOM of dealing with cookies and also this idea of JSON, which is a way of encapsulating data and use it later on. Right, so we'll look at that as well. All right, so object-oriented revisited. Basically, we have the concepts of an object, right? So we create these abstract ideas. We call these classes, right? So we create a class, and that basically encapsulates everything about the object, okay? So that will, we can create classes like person. You might think of the homework where we will be creating a class called maybe grade or assignment or student, depending on the logic that you're trying to follow. So it's really pretty open, wide open to whatever it is that you want to do. Now we know that an object in object-oriented programming will have, attributes, which are the variables associated with that object. They will also have behaviors. But now remember, because of what we're doing, dynamic web applications, we have also this idea of events, right? And we've seen that. So we'll have event handlers and events, and they can be associated with the classes as well and the objects. Also, just concepts directly from OOP, we got instantiation, which is basically you have a class, but the class is just a definition. Then, to actually use the class, you have to create an object or an instance of the class. That's called instantiation. There's also the constructor. So all languages have constructors, Python, JavaScript, etc. And it's really just a function that allows you to initialize things. So whenever you instantiate it, there's an associated constructor that just, might load the attributes with some data, etc. So this is just, all the generic concepts that you should know from object-oriented programming. And then now we can look at object-oriented programming in JavaScript. And that basically just takes us really quickly, actually, to the syntax, right? So we can easily just, creating objects in JavaScript. And really what we care about is looking at the syntax. So here we have the simplest way to create an object is to use the curly brackets. So you can see that there, we have the curly brackets. So for instance, we create the object var empty object and then curly brackets, right? Or we can also use the new object term. So we can say var empty object new object, right? But this is just a generic function name that you can use to create, some kind of an object. So now let's take a look at the attributes and properties that can be added to an object. So we have here, see var person, and we say open curly bracket, close curly bracket. Okay, and then after that, notice, remember, it's pretty standard. In most programming language, you will use the dot operator to assign things or reference things from that object. So for instance here, person dot first name, and we assign to it the word John. And then remember, you can always view it, do an alert, for instance, and actually look at the value. So we can assign a value, we can also view the value. Okay. Object literals. So we have this other approach of just directly creating the entire object, right, with object literals. So we can specify the attributes properties as name value pairs, right? So you probably heard that term before. It's very common, right? So name value pairs or key value pairs, and they're basically just the name of the attribute and then the value associated with it. So here in this example, we have var person, and then we have first name, John. Notice that the syntax has to be exactly like this. So colon, and then comma, and then we have the next one, next value pair, last name, and though, right? Though, obviously, the literal is in double quotes. All right, one can use the name key to access the value. Okay, so for instance, if I have var person and I just want from person first name, and then that should return John over there. So, you know, that's basically how this is all syntax. Okay, and really, you know, when it comes to this, the best thing to do is just open up Notepad++ and just practice these examples as we go through, you know, as we're trying to learn this topic. All right, so the readable and writable, so the properties are readable and writable, and that's really, you know, the idea. So we can access the information. All right, so constructors, another concept that should be familiar to you. All right, constructors, they're used to initialize objects, as I said before, you know, nothing new there. So here, JavaScript in particular does not use classes. It kind of uses this, you know, this approach like this. In JavaScript, constructors are basically functions, okay? So here's an example. We have the function, and we'll see this later on. We have the function person, right? And it's a default constructor. So whenever you declare something, then you use the keyword this, very much like in Python, you have, forget the term self in Python. And so it allows you to, whenever you say this, you mean this instance that I just created, and I'm going to reference these attributes from that instance. So you have first name, last name. Okay, so you can see here a definition. This points to the instance. We can also define it like this, a constructor where you pass the values as arguments. So here we have function person, this, and then basically what we're doing is assigning these values through the arguments over there. Okay. So again, this will be, when we do the examples, this will be a little bit more clear. But at least right now, we can pick up on some of the syntax and some of the keywords that is really what we want to be aware of. Now the object instantiation, so once we have the definition, right? So you can think of this as just a definition, but we want to instantiate or create an object that meets the conditions of that instance. So we use the keyword new. So here, for instance, we can create var John Doe as new person, and then John Doe gets assigned the values. Or we could also do it through this approach, var John Doe new person, and then, you know, just like we defined in the previous function, right? So we're using this function here, okay? And so we can just pass the literals, the string literals, as arguments into our code. Okay, so another example of the syntax there of an object. Now, of course, we want to have functions associated with this, so we're going to call those either behaviors or methods, right? So behaviors are also implemented as functions. You can see JavaScript is a very function-centric programming language. So here we have the example of the person constructor. So function person, this refers to that instance, and then first name, last name. But now we have a third element, right? And that's going to be this dot get full name, and get full name is just a reference, right? So it's just a reference or a name to a function. So the function is actually get full name, which will need to be defined somewhere, right? And that's defined here. So get full name, function, method, and you can see it follows the same format: function, get full name, open curly bracket, close curly bracket. And then what it does is, because it uses this and this uses this, and they're both part of the same instance, they'll be able to reference each other, right? So this will be able to find first name, last name, just like this can find get full name. And so all of that is associated together so that it becomes basically like one, like as if everything was under a class, basically. If you want to call the method, we could say, want to assign it to some variable, and then we can call person get full name. Notice this is get full name, but here we use the parentheses. Okay, so keep that in mind. That might be something that might be confusing a little bit, but with practice, you'll figure it out. All right, so that's it. That's an example of how traditionally we would create a class, let's say in C or Python, but now we did a class person, basically the constructor, and we have attributes and methods now. We know a way at least of associating attributes and methods to that particular instance. All right. Nameless methods. So these are the famous nameless methods that JavaScript has, and these are actually also used in jQuery, right? So also known as anonymous methods or anonymous functions. These are methods in an object that do not have a name. Okay, so they don't have a name basically. And what happens there is that allows you to kind of define them on the fly in the constructor itself, for instance. So notice how this is being done here instead of creating a separate function with a name and then calling it and referencing. And this will be a very common thing that we will do, you'll see in jQuery, right? So where we have function person, this, same thing as before, first name, last name. But now focus your attention on this part of the code where we have this get full name, and then we do the function definition exactly within. And this is now where that style of the curly bracket done like this starts to make sense, right? It starts to make sense because, of the way that you start to write this. So you say function, just a keyword, but no name, open parentheses, close parentheses, curly bracket. This is just a comment, right? So comment, nameless method. And then inside it's just regular code. Return this dot first name, concatenate it with this last name. And so this is, an introduction to anonymous functions, maybe something that you haven't really seen that much before. This is not really much harder than what you're seeing here, and just be aware this will become important, so definitely pay attention to this idea as we continue to go forward. It's just handy, and it's just an invention for convenience, okay? For convenience, to make your code, instead of having two functions, right? We just have everything here. So an object literal with a nameless method, so we can even do that. So instead of defining it as we were defining it here, it's almost like we're writing it in JSON format, right? If you notice over here, we do var person, notice the curly brackets, right? The curly brackets. So that kind of tells us this is a literal, an object, right? So we're defining everything. We have key value pairs, first name John, last name Doe, and then get full name, notice the colon here, and then the definition of the function is the rest of it. So this and that. So notice the contrast between this and this approach, right? So this approach is more like what we did here, right? So when we did this, no, we did it here. Sorry, this one. So this approach of defining the attributes, right, that was a much simpler version of it, but here we can use this approach to define complex things like a constructor, for instance. Okay. Again, we'll see this in the examples that we'll start doing shortly. And so that should become clear when we do that. But basically, there's two ways of doing it, and this can be handy sometimes as well. Now, if you want to call the function, it's just standard. So you create a variable full name, person object, and then get full name, and you're basically referencing this get full name, which is this definition of our code. The with statement, this is kind of an aside, but it's something that should be handy. This other languages have this as well, like Python, etc. All right, so the with statement, this is just in other languages, you know, Python. Oops. VB, Python, etc. It's just a way of grouping things. Referring to it's referring to an object, avoiding typing the same object name multiple times, right? So you don't want to type Tom dot name, Tom dot phone, Tom dot print card. Instead, you can just say Tom equal new card, some kind of an object, and then with Tom, and then after that, you specify things. Again, jQuery will be like this. A lot of this is just to show you what's behind the jQuery libraries, but it'll be very simple to similar to this. So you grab the object usually with the jQuery function, and then after that you just reference its pieces inside. So you can see here we say name Tom instead of Tom name dot Tom, phone instead of Tom dot phone, print card instead of Tom print card. So that's really the idea there. All right. So that, if you notice, pretty simple. You know, quick. We've covered the syntax of jQuery and object-oriented programming, and then, as I said shortly, we will do some example. A couple other things that we can reference here are JSON. All right, and cookies. All right, cookies you should know about. I'm sure you know you remember in the document HTML has a parameter called cookies is associated with that, and you can have multiple cookies, which is really, you can think of it as just one file that contains key value pairs, where the key value, each key value pair would be considered a cookie. Some people call it a crumb, but they're technically all the cookies associated with that object. They just happen to be in the same file. All right, so JSON. So JSON stands for the JavaScript Object Notation, okay? And it's very similar to this idea of the literal that we were talking about, right? The object literal, that format, that syntax that we use of putting things in the curly brackets themselves. So the JavaScript Object Notation, a JavaScript Object Notation is a lightweight data interchange format, okay? And notice here, data interchange. So it's used quite extensively actually for sending data, storing data. You've probably come across, oh, I found my data, but it's in JSON format. And now I have to, you know, use some Python library or write my own code from scratch to get the data out of this, right? And it's a format. So it's similar. Hopefully, when you did your ITS 110, you also covered XML a little bit, and that should have given you an idea. XML is like HTML, right? So, you know, but whereas HTML has tags for rendering things in the browser, XML is really just, you can make up your own tags. And it's really just to store data. So if I have, I think when I teach 110, I usually do the example of, you know, I have a pet store and I have dogs and cats. So I create tags, dog, and then I create tags, and I create other tags called cat. And then I have, you know, dog, you know, like dog, and then dog, right? I can create my own tags, And the idea there is I can encapsulate my information, and I know that these are all dogs in some way, right? So JSON is similar. Obviously, it's a different syntax for the format, but similar idea. It's easy for humans to read, which is good, and write. And it's also easy for machines to parse and generate. So that's the advantage, right? That you can write code that's iterative, because it's like XML. It's kind of, if you've ever thought of like a web crawler, right? If you've ever thought about that problem of web crawling and information retrieval, like what Google does, well, they crawl the entire HTML for the tags, and then based on the tags, they kind of know what information they're extracting. Similar idea here, parse and generate. We would do that in an XML file or a JSON file to extract the data. In a text format that is completely language independent, right? And that's really the great thing, that I could write the code in Python just like I could write the code in C. I could write the code in JavaScript, jQuery, whatever I want, and I can VB, and I can get the information extracted. Okay, so that's really the idea with JSON. It's smaller in size than XML, so that's probably why it has, its popularity. It comes from there, right? So these are the two very important data types, but you do see a lot of things usually stored in XML. A lot of data, for instance, for data science, etc. You can find in JSON format. All right. So the JSON object, so we'll just take a look a little bit at the syntax of JSON itself. As I said, we'll do examples of this, so don't worry about it. We'll do examples today, and then some examples on Thursday, and then I'll leave some open time on Thursday for questions about the homework. I believe you have your second homework assignment due this Thursday, so you can ask questions about that. Obviously, I will assign a homework for this. This one is a little bit more complex. I haven't decided yet how much time I'll give for this, but we'll talk about it for sure. We'll take a look at it. And then, ask questions. Usually, if you don't ask questions, I just assume you guys understand everything. And so maybe I think you're getting bored, right? And so we'll move a little bit faster. All right, so the JSON object, it'll basically, it's an object, right? It's almost like think of it as a library, if you want to think of it in terms of that, right? Like you think in C or you think in Python, right? In Python, we bring in all these libraries for all kinds of reasons. Well, think of it that way. So you're going to basically, grab that object, you see it over there, the JSON object. And the JSON object will be associated with certain methods. Okay, a couple of methods that we will be using as we start playing around with the code will be these two methods, okay? These two methods. So the parse method, as the name implies, right? So it's something to do with reading, probably, right? Parsing, and then you have the stringify, which is a funny name, right? And that just means that, as the name implies, right? You take something, an object, and you stringify it, which basically means that you convert it into an actual string of some kind. So I think, one of the things we might do for the homework is create an object, save it in a cookie, and then retrieve, that would require it to be a string to go in the cookie, and then we're going to retrieve it from the cookie as a string and save it back into the object notation, the actual data structure in JSON format. So the two functions that you probably want to take a look at are going to be the parse and stringify. So just to provide a formal definition here, the parse method, basically it's about converting a JavaScript object literal which is not a string, just keep that in mind, it's not a string, to a JSON, JSON object, right? Or sorry, no, I said that wrong. I was thinking of the other one. I apologize. So it's actually converting a string. That's what I meant. Yeah. So converting a string. So it is a string and converting it to a JSON object or a JavaScript object. Okay. So think of it that way. So for instance, I have literally here a string. This is a string. Person string. How do you know it's a string? Notice that inside there's double quotes, right? There's double quotes, but outside, I just want to make sure this, you can see the contrast really well. Outside there are single quotes. You see them there. 2 single quotes. And so the opening single quote and the closing single quote, everything in between that should only be double quotes, right? Otherwise, you'll confuse things, but this is a string. So the parse will, now obviously a string has to be, whatever is inside that string has to be in JSON format. Otherwise, parse will not work. So the way that this would go is that you sort of call JSON, call the method parse, provide the variable string, and then it'll convert it from string to object. And then after that, you can play around with the pieces of it, as you can see here. Now, person object dot, you can reference first name, and person object dot, you can reference last name. Okay, so that's the first one. So that, hopefully that makes sense. Now the second one is, the stringify method, and this one is just, as you might imagine, is the opposite. Here you start with the object. So I have new person John Doe, assuming I have that constructor already defined somewhere. I create the person object over here, and then I'm going to take that person object, and then I'm going to do JSON.stringify, and that will convert it into, should convert it into a string. So probably this should have the word string in there. I mean, it doesn't matter, but just be aware it is a string. So now this would be the kind of thing that we can store in a variable. We can store it in a little text file, in a cookie, all kinds of places like that. Don't worry about this. So just disregard that. This is the other example. And as you will see, we will work on some examples of doing this in the course, in the class. Are there any questions so far, guys?
No questions.
No questions.
No questions.
All right, I'm glad. Okay, so now, hopefully this is making sense. A few additional things that might, obviously you want to have a little bit more power as you do things. So we always want to throw in arrays in there. So we will look at some examples of that as well. Right, so I'll code. So, I enjoy just doing the coding and seeing if it works. And so that will be the approach. Arrays in JavaScript object, and also its relation to JSON. So the property value of a JavaScript object could be an array. That's perfectly fine. For instance, the person's property, right, has a value of an array. And that in itself can be an array of person objects. So an array can be an array of objects, which is great. That's what makes JavaScript actually so flexible, right? And that allows it to have, jQuery, if you think about it, it's an amazing thing. It truly is. And so, it's important. So you have here, for instance, we're going to take our definition. Notice the literal object literal. So I create person's object, got my curly bracket over here, curly bracket over there. And then I have a colon, right? So keep that, remember the key, that's a key value pair. So the key is, or the name value pair, however you want to call it, and then here you have persons. But persons references an array because you've got these square brackets over here, right? Like a list in Python, right? So you have the square brackets, and then you have, if you notice, inside, you have your actual class. Obviously, that function needs to be defined somewhere, but that would be then you have comma separated new person John Doe, new person Jane Doe, new person Luke Peters. So these are all used to kind of populate these objects. We can also take this approach over here. So literally we can do var persons object similar, curly bracket, similar, persons, similar. And then over here, notice in the square brackets now, instead of having the objects themselves, we also have a literal. So we got the curly bracket over there, right? And then comma, curly brackets. So we got key value, key value, key value, key value, key value, key, well, sorry, I should say, maybe that was misleading. Key value, key value, key value, key value, and so on. Now with this one, I don't expect you to memorize this. I wouldn't say it's necessary to memorize it. It's more about practice it in the code, follow the instructions in the homework, do it as it's required. As you will see later on, one of the things I keep saying about jQuery is that jQuery is not just some library of functions, it's also an interface. And so it has a tendency to be very intuitive. And so you'll figure out ways of creating all these things in jQuery very efficiently. But right now, think of this as just mainly trying to understand the underlying, like if in the car, right? So you open the hood of the car, we're trying to see how things work underneath. All right. Okay, so let's keep going then. All right, obviously when we have an array, it's all about, populating the array with a for loop or something like that. So we'll take a look at that as well. To retrieve each property's value of a person object, the array has to be retrieved first, and then you loop through each element or person object of the array. So, we'll see that. That's probably better as we start coding it. It'll be a little bit clearer. But as I said, right now what's important is to take a look at the syntax. So because we'll be using this syntax for our examples. Right, so we got here persons, right? So that's just the previous thing that we had before. So we can iterate through this persons and think of it, as a list or as an array. So, standard for loop that we saw last week, right? And then we can access via index, right, each object. So you think of persons as very much as a list in Python, and then just access that index, and then you got the object, and then just extract the values. All right. All right, and then there's cookies. So cookies are basically, as I said, they're part of the DOM, the document object model. So whenever you have an HTML page, you have a DOM object. We've already defined it and talked about it's a hierarchical tree type of a data structure made up of nodes and links, and there is this relationship of children of a parent node. So you got nodes that are parents, and then they have children nodes, and so on. All right, so cookies are an element of just the DOM as well that is associated with that page. And basically, you can think of it as, in its simplest definition, you can think of it as a string containing a list of name value pairs. So it's almost like you can think, name 1 colon value 1, and then something like semicolon, and then name true, value, 2, semicolon, and then dot, 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 right? So each one of these is a cookie, sometimes referred to as a crumb, just so that, because you know, the idea, I guess, would be that you take the cookie and you break it into pieces. So you break a cookie into crumbs, and so that's kind of the idea. All right. Name value pairs are separated by semicolons. You can see that over there. See that over there. We'll see some examples of how to do that. We won't be using cookies for everything that we do in our semester. You know, data will be stored eventually in databases, obviously, but cookies are useful, as you know, for sessions. So we'll definitely see sessions as towards the end of the semester when we look at creating. You know, remember our goal is to create a user-based web application. So that means you need to have a login, username, and password, and all that. Okay. So Chrome, as I said, so here it is, the word. It's basically a name value pair in the format name and value. So it's actually probably not a colon, but an equal sign, it seems. All right, so we'll see that in some of the examples. We'll do at least one of that. So I think that should be enough there. A cookie, basically, definition, it just contains a list of name value pairs, which is what I said. And it can also contain other parameters like expires. So that can be something associated with the cookie. So if you set no expiration date on a cookie, it expires when the browser closes. If you set an expiration date, the cookie is saved across browser sessions. If you set an expiration date in the past, the cookie is deleted, basically. Now, cookies used to be, I think this changed. It's funny. I never saw the change, but it happened sometime between 2014 and 2016, where it used to be that all data was stored in cookies, you know, browsers, for advertisements, right? And so you could just literally delete your cookies, and you certainly knew all the data had been deleted, all the data that tracked you in your browsing history. That's, I'm sure you guys, hopefully you knew that, but that's no longer the case, as you probably know. That thanks to Facebook, and we have them to thank, Google. So they have a separate set of companies, adware, and these companies basically keep track of your data now, not just in these cookies, but somehow, I mean, in multiple ways, is really what I would say. They just have multiple ways, including on their servers. So that's how they keep your profile. So just even though you are deleting your cookies, don't think that the data of your browsing and everything like that, your privacy, basically, don't think that it's gone. It's not. It's actually, they'll use information that's unique to your browser, to your computer, to your IP, to your geolocation, lots of things to create a profile. And then whenever you use that browser, that computer, they just know it's you. So they have a new way now of tracking you, which is actually pretty complex, I think. I've tried to, you know, as part of like privacy research, I've tried to look at it, and it's just incredibly convoluted, just so that people can't really get to it. But anyway, but it used to be that the cookie was this element of, okay, you delete the cookies and you're done. And that's not exactly the case anymore. But as a mechanism of storing data associated with an HTML, that's still there. It's just that, as I said, you know, they figured out other places other than the cookies to store data, or other ways of keeping track of you. If you're interested in that, you can take a look at, I have it here somewhere. You can take a look at, I think I have it. Maybe I don't have it anymore. Oh, you can take a look at, I found it. You can take a look at your ad choices. You know, it's about ads.info. Go there and you'll figure out that there's actually a lot of companies, 100 or so. One of them belongs to Google, and they all basically deal with how they keep track of you nowadays. So there's a lot of information there if you're interested. All right, so that was an aside, actually. Okay, all right, so let's go back to what we were talking about, cookies. I guess when I talk about cookies, I should mention that. All right, let's go on then to, now let's get back into the syntax. Retrieving cookies, so you probably remember this from your 110 class. You have document.cookie. And so basically with document.cookie, this is how you reference, you know, from DOM, from the document object model is used to set, get all cookies associated with the current document. So, you know, in the simplest form, it is like that. We will look at, when you guys take 450, for instance, and we look at web security, remember this course is about getting you guys to understand dynamic web development from a point of view of writing the code from scratch. It's not so much focused on security issues. Security issues are quite complex and will be covered more so in 450. But we will see that, you know, cookies keep the session, for instance, right? They keep the session ID that we'll see later on when we look at accounts and how they work. That session ID is associated with your information in the server. So attackers may sometimes try to steal your cookies, right? And so, you know, so basically getting access to this object is also important. All right, but we'll talk about those things later. So I want to make that clear that, you know, the reason why I don't cover a lot of security topics in 362 is basically because they'll be covered in 450, right? Which, you know, I strongly recommend, obviously, that you take these two courses in sequence. That's, you know, that's how you should do it, since one is a third year, one's a fourth year. All right, so yeah, so back to the syntax here. We have our cookies, then we grab documents.cookies. Then, as you might imagine, we want to keep, you know, some kind of cookie string just to store the data. All right, so if cookies length, notice there's a parameter equal 0, we assert that it's a 0 there, then there's nothing in the cookies, right? Else, however, basically we have, we can use the function split, very similar to what you have, you know, Python split function, right? So we do cookies.split. We're going to split, notice, on semicolon over here. And that basically, it gives you an array of cookies, all right? And now we have cookies length. You know, we can basically figure that out. And then, you know, a little for loop allows us to iterate through this little array. Very easy with the index there, square brackets. And we can just extract the pieces of the cookie or the crumbs. And also notice we can do the trick that we learned last week, which was to concatenate code with tags so that the output looks a little bit more presentable. All right, so that's an example of retrieving information, really the crumbs in a cookie. Okay, so we'll take a look at that. All right, so let's move on to the next. All right, so creating, setting cookies. So if a name cookie exists, it gets updated, right? So that's basically how it works. So here we have cookie name, document get element by ID, cookie name, right? And we get the values. So we got that from maybe the text box or something. So we have also, so the cookie name and the cookie value, get it from another text box. And now this is the part where we're going to add this over to the actual cookie in the HTML page. So the document.cookie. All right, so we're going to take cookie name. Notice the character is actually the equal sign, and we're going to use escape. Right, so we'll see this later on. These functions are to ensure that whenever we have spaces and things like that, they get appropriately encoded, possibly for URL encoding and things like that. So, you know, a URL doesn't support like spaces, for instance, right? It uses something like a, can't remember the number, but instead of a space, it's like %20 or something. So these escapes, we'll see how they work, but they basically provide that to convert certain characters to other characters and so on. Okay, but we'll see examples of that later. Right, and that's basically it. Notice that we are adding something to the cookie, so it's got to have the cookie name, it's going to have the equal sign, it's got to have the cookie value, and notice also it has to have the semicolon to say that we've concluded that crumb in the cookie. And later on, then we can add even more crumbs to the end of the cookie. All right. All right, so that's good. Deleting cookies, that might be something that you might have to do in the homework as well. So deleting is done by setting the expires attribute to a past date, right? So a date in the past. So for instance, here we have cookie name, get element by ID. We get that from some text box. We have in JavaScript we can easily get today's date just by doing var date new date. So now we have today's date. Then we can say date set month, and then easily then we get month -1 because it's going to be a numeric thing. So if it's 3, it'll be 3 minus 1, so it's 2, and so that's going to be in the past, 1 month prior. So that gives us a way of setting the date, and then now we can just go into document.cookie called cookie name. Notice that we don't really care about the value it has because we're actually going to delete it. And then right after the semicolon, we can plug in expires and then just put in this. And that's just the date that we just got from here that we just set to a month ago. And so that way, this crumb in the cookie will be associated with a date in the past, and therefore it would just be deleted. Are there any questions about that?
No questions at the moment.
Sounds like it's making sense, so that's pretty good. And like I said, we'll practice this, of course. I haven't decided if this lab is going to be a 2-week lab. It'll just depend. I'm starting to see that the lecture is taking a while, and I do have a lot of examples. So we'll see it. It might be 2 weeks, which is fine. I don't want to rush you guys, but I also don't want to go too slowly. All right, so that should be, I think, this is just, read through this. These are just some cookie restrictions. Cookies are, this is more of a security thing. Cookies are tied to a specific domain. Ensuring that information stored in a cookie is available only to approved recipients and cannot be accessed by other domains. This is actually called same origin policy, SOP. And we will, or web SOP sometimes. All browsers should follow this design principle, and that's why we trust. That's why you don't use some random browser, right? You just should only use Safari, Mozilla, Firefox, Chrome, because they follow these kinds of rules that it wouldn't be good if you have 2 websites open, one for your bank and one from, you get an email and it says, click here and win $1 million. And you click on it and it opens up another website in your browser. And then that browser with its JavaScript tries to get the cookie from your bank as you're logged in, right? So that would be really bad. And so that's called same origin policy. We'll cover this in 450. I'll show you guys how that works. And basically the idea there is that, what this just stated. So it's domain specific. You know, don't this, you know, these numbers are always changing, so don't worry about that. Safari and Chrome really, you know, no hard limit on the number of cookies per domain. So you can see that. And then, you know, they might have some limits, but I'm not sure what that value currently is. Probably more, much more than that. All right, so, okay, that's it. So that's the slides, pretty good. You can see now, these slides are really great, I think, always pretty short, but to the point. So now that we've covered these slides, the thing we're gonna do now is I am going to switch over to Notepad++, and we're just gonna do some examples. I'm not gonna read the homework assignment today. I know sometimes I do that to motivate, but we'll wait to do that on Thursday. And instead today, let's just do one example. I want to get at least, you know, a couple of examples done today so that you know now the lecture and now you can get into the mindset. Obviously, guys, you know, the first two homework assignments were extremely easy. This one now gets a little bit more into code, right? So remember, this course is entirely 100% software development. You know, it's you know, building, you know, the best kind of web applications that you can think. Not for mobile. Remember, it's only for like regular computers, but on the client and server side. So right now we're going to do just a simple example of object-oriented programming with JavaScript. So let me see. So I need to open up I'm going to go to my 362. This week, I'm going to create a new folder, and you know, as you might imagine, makes sense to call it OOP. So create a folder on your desktop where you have your ITS 362. Create a third folder, OOP. Then right-click there, create a new document, new text document, and call it. What are we going to do? Let's see. We can do an object literal. Let's do that. Let's call it object literal 1 maybe. Change the extension to HTML. Enter. Yes. Okay. Now, once you create the document, open it with Notepad++.
I'm not sure if it's just for me, but I can't see your screen.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I need to share. There you go. So Notepad++, right? So everyone should be here, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So now that you're here, you know, same pipeline that we've been using all so far, not all semester, but so far in the semester. We are going to do a simple script of an object. We're going to create a person object. Keep in mind, for the assignment, you will probably be creating either a student object or you will be creating a assignment object. It's really, I'm not going to tell you what to do, honestly. I'm going to let you guys, you know, use your own judgment. Zoom in a little bit. Okay. All right, so that's zoomed in, hopefully enough. So add also, you know, same as we always do. Head section, you know, get into the habit of these. I know it's repetitive, but you know, I'm a firm believer in writing the code. You know, if you're just always, oh, I'm going to look for some starter code, and you know, that's not, I wouldn't recommend that. All right, so now that I have this, really all I want, you know, it's pretty much the same thing as we always do. We're going to have some event. So for now, we're mostly doing onload because it's the easiest. So onload, create a function, display person, right? So now we're going to create an object, person. Oops. Get rid of that. All right, so display person. And then in here, in the body, I'm going to have a div, span, some kind of element, whatever it is, as long as it's got a name. And I'm going to reference its message. Okay. All right, and then so I have some element there that I can reference by the ID. So it's pretty much what we've been doing so far in the semester. I'm going to create my script tag. Script. All right, so now the trick is I definitely need that display person function. That's just a regular function. Okay, I'm going to call it display person, open curly bracket, close curly bracket. Okay, so now that I have this, I can, now comes the practice of creating the objects, right? So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a person, an empty person object. So I'm going to do var person, and then I'm going to assign to it with 2 curly brackets, that's it. That's my empty object. Now on the fly, really, I can add elements to it. So I can say person dot first first name, and we're just going to say, John Doe. So John. Right, so semicolon here, and then we're going to do the same for the last name. So notice we're adding a couple of attributes. Last name. So, okay, so we've got those 2 elements. Additionally, and that's it. That's our very simple example. Now we're going to create a variable that is going to take those 2 values. We can call it full name. And we're just going to now assign to it person dot first name. And we're going to concatenate space and the last name. So we do person again dot last name. Okay, and that's it. That's pretty much it. Now, if we want to display it on our span, we just take the exact same approach we took before. Var, we want to create an object, just because that's usually how jQuery does it. Label message, we assign to it. How do we get the object, right? So far document dot get get element by ID. And we look up message. All right, so we look at message. Now we have the object, and now we can easily just assign to it our value. So we're going to say label message, just like before, dot inner.html, inner HTML, and we assign to it full name. So if this works, you can actually run that yourselves, right? And hopefully If you run that successfully, it'll print out the information. But this time around, you have used an object, right? So that's really the trick, is that you've used object-oriented programming. This will become useful because if you have grades, you're going to have a lot of grades, right? So, you know, you'll have to think about, you know, are these labs or these participations, etc. All right, so let's go ahead and I'm going to save it. And now you can go ahead and run it. And hopefully you get John Doe. So if you want to, you know, my example, I'm just going to share, I guess, the screen. And you can see that's what the output should look like. Are there any questions about this one?
I don't think so.
Pretty easy, right? Pretty straightforward. All right, great. So let's do another one then. This one will have a little bit more. This is the example where we have the function, right? So now we're going to have a method also associated with the class. So let's go back to Notepad++. Okay. And really, with this one, we can use the exact same code, right? So we can use the same script that we have already. We just need to add now the element of a, we're going to modify it a little because we're going to add a second function. So we have, if you want, we still have display person. I'm actually going to delete this part. So we can start a little bit from scratch, but we can use the entire structure. So now, instead of doing it that way, I'm going to have a function, an additional function. I'll make sure these are all. Okay, I'm going to have a function, and this function will be person, right? So this is kind of like, if you think of it like the class, if you will. And then I do curly bracket. I'm going to do close curly bracket. And then in here is really where I'm going to try to define my object. Therefore, on display person, all I have to do is reference or call that function. So I'm going to say var person and assign to it new person. So I assign to it new person, like that, open curly bracket, close curly bracket, right? So that means then that I need to define this over here, all right? So notice this is basically when we talked about it in the slides, this is the person constructor. Okay, so now in here, I'm going to say, you know, if I want to reference it, I'm going to say this dot first name, right? And I assign to it initially nothing. So it's initialized to nothing. I do the same for last name. I'm going to type this dot last. Just to be consistent, I should probably make this n. All right, and then last name as well. Like that, we assign to it nothing. Okay, now here also I'm gonna just really combine several of those slides and just also create my anonymous function. So I'm gonna say this dot get full name, right? And get full name will be associated with the anonymous function. So notice here, no need for a name, just do this, right? And that provides, or the nameless method or function. So that allows me to just provide some code in here that can manipulate those two. So as you might imagine, all this does is it returns the combined first name and last name. So it's going to be this dot first name plus, and then this dot last name. Okay, so I've got both of these, and that's it, right? As you can see now, this is a pretty handy way of defining the attributes, the methods, all associated with person. So now this instantiation of the person class, if you will, person object, provides you with now an object person that you can reference. And so now that I have this, obviously we will probably want to add some names to it. So I'm going to say person dot first name, and I'm going to assign to it, Mary. Okay, and then I'm also going to do last name. So I can call person dot last name and assign to it, let's say Smith. So Mary Smith, for instance, have that there. Okay. And then finally, since full name was the variable that it was assigned to that label message, we can still use that. How would you write this part? So I need now the full name, right? So how would you write that part?
You could just change full name to person.get full name.
Exactly. Very good. So now all we have to do is call person dot, and then we reference that name, get full name. Notice the use of the parentheses here. And what I would recommend is try this both with the parentheses, without the parentheses. Play with it, right? Get a feel for what's going on. And then now, label message will, get full name, and then hopefully will display Mary Smith. So go ahead and try that one on your computer. I saved it. All right, and then you should be able to see it on your own end. If I share, right, so you should be seeing there Mary Smith, and that just kind of illustrates, what we discussed in the lecture pretty clearly. All right. Any questions so far? I think you guys are getting it, so it's pretty good. Let's see, what else do we have here that's interesting? Okay. All right, so we have, there's a few things. Obviously, we have to get to the JSON part. I won't get to that one today. Today, I just want to do examples of the general object-oriented programming part. Let's do one where we define the object as an object literal. So that's pretty similar, or it's one of the things that we covered in the slides. So let's go ahead and switch to Notepad++. For this one, I like to keep the script separate, so I'm going to close this one, and I'm going to create a new one. Let's call it example 2. open it with Notepad++. And you can just copy all of that. And now let's take out pretty much all the script. Let's just take that out. That gives us the basic structure of it. So we're still going to have a display person, span, and the script. Now the key thing is that we're going to declare the object in a little bit differently. Using that idea of the object literal, right? So I'm going to do var person, and now notice here, instead of using like new person and all that like we did before, I'm just going to define it as key value pairs within curly brackets. Okay, so I'm going to say here, first name. So first name John, comma, and now we can move this down, and also do last name colon, say Doe, John Doe, and then add the curly bracket or semicolon. All right, so that's the object literal right there. As you can see, pretty much the same thing. Now we're going to try to access it, access both of these, and assign them to a variable called full name. So we can do var full name, assign to it. Then there's a couple of ways that we can try to do this. So one is call person dot first name. There we go. And then we're going to concatenate. But here, let's try a different approach. Let's see person square brackets and then provide last name, right? Kind of like treating it like a list. Okay, so we've got last name there. And hopefully that will access John Doe, the information. So now pretty easily we can just call label message. Label message, we call document get element by ID. Call message. Semicolon. All right, and then now we assign our value to label message dot inner HTML. Oops. Inner HTML, and we assign full name. All right, so if that worked out, should be John Doe. Close that one. Save it. And now refresh the page.
You didn't put it inside of the function.
Did I? Oh, yeah. Sorry. Thank you. Good catch. All right, so you have to do function display person, right? So display person. Call the function there. Curly bracket. And then we just have to close. close curly bracket. Okay, so hopefully this time it'll work. All right, so try it. You guys can try it out. Save. Example 2, John Doe. And it works for me, I think. So you can see it there. And that's, you know, it's just another way of doing this, right? Another example with the object literal. All right, so let's see, what else do we have? All of these pretty simple. Now I guess I did the anonymous function, but we also could have done the non-anonymous function example. So what I can do there is we can open the previous script. So go ahead and open the previous one, and we're just going to make that little tweak, right? So instead of doing it, so you guys, oh, sorry, sharing the notepad. So instead of doing it like this, where I added the anonymous function in there, we're just going to tweak it a little so that this is a separate thing. So you can take that out. Code is still the same, right? Notice the code is still the same. It's going to be, you know, onload display person, span, and then we have here HTML script. We still have display person. Same idea, we create a new person, person equal new person, first name, last name. But now, this is the thing that we're going to worry about. So full name will be person.getFullName. That should still be the same thing. And then we take the value and assign it to the label. So really, the change needs to happen here, right? So in the constructor, instead of using an anonymous function, we're just going to reference an outside function. And that can be done just by typing this dot, you know, get full name. Got that there, get full name. And then now we are going to assign to this the name of a function. So we're going to create a function. So I'm going to call it get, you know, get full name function, for instance, right? Or something along those lines. Or we can just leave it as get full name, add a semicolon. And now the trick is, though, that we need to define it outside here. So I'm going to create a third function. This one's going to be get full name, open parentheses, close parentheses. And as you can see, the disadvantage of this is that you have more functions now. That's why the anonymous function is actually kind of neat in a way. It makes your code simpler, I would think. So now here we have to do return, you know, return this dot first name, right? And then we're going to concatenate it. And we do this dot last semicolon. So now that's the function. As you can see, pretty much the same thing, except now it's a separate function instead of being an anonymous function. So let's say Jane Smith. All right, let's try this one out. Hopefully I haven't missed anything. Let's go. if I share the screen, you can see there it says James Smith. So that's, you know, two versions of pretty much the same thing, pretty easy and straightforward. Okay. All right, so we're actually doing well with time. I think we have time for one more example. So let's take a look. So we've got the JSON examples that we can do. There's a few additional things that we can also play with as well. So we can do that. And then we'll do we need to do the arrays one, which that one obviously, that's a long one. So I'm going to save that for Thursday. Oh, we can do this one today. And of course, the cookies one, that's certainly the longest one. And then for this week, I will give you a little bit of intuition about the homework as well, given that that's a much more complex problem. So we've got a few scripts that we can do today, just kind of for fun. Let's see. So actually, let's do another example of object-oriented. This time, it'll be like a business card. All right, so let's do that one, which is the example in the slides that use the keyword with as well. Let's do that. And then you guys can remind me on Thursday of what examples we do. All right, so for this one, let's do it a little bit different, actually. So let's start sort of from scratch. I'm going to create a new file in my folder. And this is going to be called, with.htm. That's the example. Open that with Notepad++. All right. Close the other two. All right. So this one, just another example of a simple object-oriented programming example. Let's do our basic tags. No. And then we've got the head section. Okay. You can also do the body tag. All right. So we've got that done. Now we're going to just create in the body. We're not going to do an onload method. Instead, for this one, we're going to try something else. Let's create just a button. I'm going to do input type button so that we can start trying out some other approaches. So button. Okay. And then, set a value. You can just say click. And what happens when you click? So we're going to have an on-click event. And the on-click event will call a function. So let's call it test with function. All right, so we're going to call that function just like that. All right, so then we need to obviously define that function. So we're going to go to the head section. Script. All right, and then now in here, remember, we're going to do some object-oriented approach. So test with is basically the first function that we would call. So we're going to do function test with. All right, so we need to define what we're going to do in this function. So basically, we want to create a new business card. So it's going to be for Tom, right? So Tom, new card. So that means we want to define a card object. So that's something that we're going to need to create here. We can do new card. And then from that, we're going to manipulate that card in some way. So now we need to think about card itself. So we need that function, card. All right. And this time, this is going to be the constructor. It can take some parameters, right, if we want to. So we can say, for instance, here, let's just try if we had values. So name and phone. Right, so let's just think about that. Then this function is the constructor, so we need to initialize. We're going to have this name. We assign to it, obviously, name. And then this, we're also going to have like phone number. And that would just be the argument phone. Right, and then we can have, then we also have a function for printing the results. Okay, so we're going to have a function for printing the results. Let's call it print card, let's say. Print card. And we need to define then a function called, let's say print card. So that means that this function needs to also be created, because we're not going to do the anonymous function here, although as an exercise for yourself, you should do it, right? You should define your own print card, do the anonymous equivalent of what I'm doing. The anonymous function or nameless function. So here, instead of doing the label message also, let's just try a different approach. This is from 110, just grab document, and then you can use the document.write parameter or method. And then now you can write out whatever you want on there. So for instance, we can try name is, and then concatenate with this dot name, right? Concatenate, put a break line, sorry. A BR tag in there. And then try phone is, let's just say phone is. And we can try to concatenate this as well. And then you can add this dot phone. All right, so we're just, you're just playing with code to kind of get different outputs. But now we have a working function. So remember the document.write, that's just, we're just going to write to the page instead of assigning to the inner HTML of a label, or sorry, a tag. We've got the print card here. We got the card. And then in test with now, we created the object, new card. So really, we need to assign values to name and phone. So we can try something like with that example that we saw in the slides. And then we can say with Tom, because that's the object that we just created, you know, I can create, now I can assign the parameters. And so instead of typing tom.name, I can just say name, and I assign to it Tom, right? And then I'm gonna do phone, and I assign to this a phone. So I'm gonna say, you know, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0. Okay. All right, so that's the phone, and then finally, nothing happens here except that we've assigned the data, so we probably need to make a reference to print card. So we need to make a reference to print card here. So I'm just going to say print card. Remember the parentheses when you actually call the function. So hopefully if this works, go ahead and try it. And when you click, it should print out Tom and the phone number. So let's see if that works. I'm going to hit save. And then I'm going to open that file. Okay, and if I share the screen, you can see I already pressed the button, and it overwrote the button, and it just printed out the data. Obviously, we could have done that with a label message also. Same thing, just this is just another example, basically, of doing things. All right, are there any questions on this example?
I don't think I have any, at least.
I think it sounds like everyone's understanding things. You know, everyone's very quiet, so that's good. So that's basically object-oriented, as you can see. A lot of this is pretty straightforward because you already know what object-oriented programming is, and it's just a little bit of syntax. So on Thursday, I will probably start with a few examples. Then I'll talk about the homework. Then I'll continue with the homework. Maybe on Tuesday. It depends on time. So this lab may be a 2-week lab. We'll talk about it certainly. I do remember that this one's a little bit longer than the other ones. So we might take 2 weeks on this, and then some of the topics in and then after that we'll be ready for jQuery, I believe, and some of the jQuery is pretty straightforward in the beginning as well. All right, remember that we'll be doing client side until the middle of the semester, and then during when we start the second half of the semester, we'll do server side, which is basically PHP, and combine both. Obviously, we need to combine both to create a dynamic website. All right, I'll stay for a couple of minutes if you guys have any questions. Otherwise, this is a good stopping point. We're going to stop here for today, and I will see you guys Thursday.